Hey guys, I'm going to be doing a tutorial today on the Amiga emulator FS-UAE and how to integrate it into the emulator front-end Launchbox. Now, for a little background for my existing subscribers that are probably completely confused about why I'm making this video, because this is the first video I've made of this nature or on the subject, I'm a moderator over on the Launchbox forums, where I go by the name Zombeaver, and I typically fill a sort of tech support role, helping people resolve various issues with their emulator and or Launchbox setup. Launchbox, in case you don't know what that is an emulator front end that basically allows you to organize your emulator and ROM collection in a cohesive, visually appealing way. It's just a really great way to bring everything together in a single, easily manageable space. I've been using it on a regular basis for about a year now, I guess a little bit over. So I've got a very good grasp on how to use it and how to integrate a wide variety of emulators with it. For a lot of emulators, it's actually a very simple process of just directing Launchbox to the appropriate emulator and ROM files, and that's it. But for some platforms, it can be a bit more complicated, which is why I'm making this video. For some time now, Amiga has been one of the more difficult platforms to get into emulating for a variety of reasons, but home computer emulation, in other words, not just a simple game console, has always had the tendency to be a bit more difficult because of the additional complexity that brings. And in the case of the Amiga, you're talking about a whole line of computers, not just a single immutable device. So obviously, that's going to create an additional layer of complication. But it's okay. It's not really too bad once you get the hang of it. So that's what I'm here to help with. For quite a while now, whenever I wanted to emulate the Amiga, I used WinUAE, which is a fine emulator. It does what it's supposed to do, and it does it well. But intuitive and newbie-friendly, it is not. I had to poke and prod and fumble my way through it until I finally figured out what the heck I was doing with it. Again, I'm not saying it's a bad emulator at all, because it's not by any means. But I don't think it's a stretch to say that WinUAE is at least part of the reason that Amiga emulation has a bit of a stigma for being daunting, because WinUAE can be a bit daunting when you first get started. I've been using emulators since the 90s with ZSNES, and I felt pretty clueless when I started using WinUAE. FS-UAE, by comparison, is pretty user-friendly and easy to get set up and running. Is it as simple as getting an SNES game up and running? No, which is why I'm making this video. But by comparison to WinUAE, it's definitely a step up in regards to user-friendliness. There are some aspects that are a bit unintuitive, but I'll try and cover most of those as well, so that you don't have to dig through help docs and forum posts and all that crap, like I had to do in a few instances. I'm going to try to make this video as clear as I can, and for potential users that know little to nothing about the Amiga or Amiga emulation. So if you already have some experience with Amiga emulation, some of the stuff may be really obvious. Just understand that that isn't the case for everyone, and I don't want to leave things out because I take certain pieces of information for granted or mistakenly assume that certain things are just common knowledge. I want this video to be basically for any person who just happens to have some slight interest in emulating the Amiga, but doesn't know the first thing about how to do that. I'm going to start with setting up FS-UAE itself, which I'll be referring to as simply FS from here on out, and then go into incorporating it into Launchbox. So this video should be useful whether you plan on using Launchbox or not. If not, then you can just follow the initial steps to set up FS, and you'll be good to go. I'm going to be placing timestamps in the description for specific sections of the tutorial, as well as links to a number of different files you'll need for your setup, along with some useful resources. I'm also going to have a link to a Google Doc of the script for this tutorial, which is also broken up into sections, and the section titles are linked directly to the appropriate timestamps in the video. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to go over is some of the preliminary setup steps that you'll need to do when you first load up FS. The first thing that you're going to want to do is import the Kickstart files. Kickstarts are essentially the OS/firmware versions that were used for the various Amiga models. So you'll need these to properly emulate each model. Now, FS does come with its own internal versions of these, but they're essentially what I would call fake versions that aren't quite as accurate and can cause problems with some games. So you'll really want to get a hold of the real ones. I can't supply those to you, but I can supply you with FS's Kickstart file name list, which will tell you exactly what it's looking for, and it is very picky about it. There are several different versions of any given Kickstart file, and FS has specific ones that it looks for. Google is your friend here, but I can tell you that if you grab a TOSEC Amiga set, almost all of these are included in the firmware folder. Everything except for the A3000, I think, which honestly isn't a huge deal. It's a bit convoluted, but my understanding is that the version FS looks for the A3000 isn't one that was ever officially released on a physical ROM chip, so it's not in the TOSEC set, or at least wasn't the last time I checked. I'll place a link in the description for the Kickstart file name list. Once you've got your Kickstart files, you want to put those in FS's Kickstarts folder. Once you're done with that, go ahead and load up the launcher that you'll see in the base FS folder. Now, on that note, I'll be using the 2.8.0 stable version of FS in this video, but developer version 2.7.15 or higher will work for this as well, as that's what I'm actually using in my real Launchbox setup. It does need to be one of those two, though, because stable versions prior to 2.8.0 won't work for what we're doing here. Depending on what version you're using, your launcher exec may be named slightly differently, but it should still be something launcher.exec. I'm also using the portable, i.e. non-installer version, but this should work for the installer version as well. So go ahead and load up the launcher, and then click on the drop-down at the top left, and then click Update File Database, and then click the Scan button. As long as you have the correct Kickstart files and they're in the Kickstarts folder, you'll see these little boxes next to the name of each model change to a green check mark. That indicates that you've got the correct file for that model, and FS will now use it when emulating that model. The one that's probably the most important here, in my opinion, is the A1200. There are exceptions, but by and large, this is what I use for just about everything. Most of the built-in game configs in FS use the 1200, and in some cases where they don't, I've actually created my own custom configs that use the A1200 instead. But we'll get back to that in a bit. Now, before I get into importing your games into FS, I'm going to go over a few tweaks that you can make to it that you may find useful. These aren't required, but you'll probably want to do them just the same. So once again, click on the drop-down at the top left, and this time go to Settings. The first thing I'm going to do here is go to the Audio section and disable the floppy drive sound emulation. This is a kind of neat feature that emulates the sound that the floppy drive would make as it's accessing data on the disk, and it actually sounds pretty good. But honestly, I just prefer to have this off because it's more of a novelty than anything else. So to do that, you can uncheck the default button and then reduce the number, which represents the volume level, to 0. The next thing I'm going to do is go to the Video section and change the Keep Aspect Ratio when scaling, do not stretch option from the default of off to on. I honestly have no idea why the default is set to off here. I'm not sure why you'd want the image to stretch to the wrong aspect ratio by default, but whatever. You may or may not want to change the video synchronization setting from off to auto, depending on your monitor. It does introduce some amount of input latency. I'm going to be leaving this off. I'm also going to change the Start FS-UAE in full screen mode to on. This way your games will launch directly into full screen when we get them set up in Launchbox. And of course, when you launch them through FS-UAE itself, they will be launching into full screen as well. Now we're going to go to the game database section and change the database games section from the default of available and downloadable games to just available games. Just like the other things I'm mentioning here, you don't have to do this, but I think it makes the list look a lot cleaner. It'll actually be empty with this setting until you import some games, after which it'll only show you the games that you've imported. If you don't use this option, it's also going to include games in the list that you don't actually have but can be downloaded through FS. I just prefer to only see what I actually have. Now we're going to do something a bit more complicated and add in a couple of useful actions that you can map to your controller, which are warp mode, which is basically a fast forward function, and F10. I'll go over why you want F10 mapped a bit later, but for now just know that this button is what you're going to be using to exit the emulator. The first thing you need to do in order to accomplish this is go to the joysticks and gamepad section, where you'll see your controller listed. Double-click on the controller name, and you'll be presented with a map of the various button names which you'll be using to map specific actions. It'll show a PS3 controller regardless of the controller you're actually using. I'm actually using a wireless 360 controller, but the button names and positions should correlate to your controller regardless. So pick a button that you want to use for fast forward. I'm going to be using the right trigger button. And note the specific button name because you'll be using it in a moment. Now do the same thing for a button that you want to use to quit out of the emulator. I'm going to use the right thumbstick button for this because it's not something I'm going to hit accidentally. You'll also want to note the name of the controller in the joystick and gamepad section because you're going to need that as well when you add it into the advanced settings. So now go ahead and go to the advanced settings section. And for the one that you want to use for the warp, you're going to put it in like this. So the name of the controller, and then the button name, and then space equals space action underscore warp. And for the one that we're going to use for fast forward, we're going to do the same thing. The controller name, x input underscore controller in my case, underscore button underscore 7 equals action underscore key underscore F10. I'm also going to include a list of all of the available actions that are mappable in the description. I just use action warp and action key F10, but there are some other useful functions in there that you may want to add in too. The process is the same. Just pick a button name and add it into the advanced settings, and then space equals space, and then the action name that you want to use. One of the things you might want to consider adding in here is unsafe underscore save underscore states. What this does is enable save states for WHDLoad games, which are disabled by default. The reason they're disabled is they're a bit iffy for WHDLoad games, to the point that the developer has said that he actually doesn't recommend using them. Using normal in-game saves is much safer. That said, the option is there as long as you enable it with this line. Just be aware that your mileage may vary, and it may or may not work from one game to another. If using normal in-game saves doesn't bother you, you can just disregard this. I don't use it myself. Okay, now we're going to want to create an account for the Open Amiga Games database. The reason we want to do this is because this will allow us to hook into a very large database of Amiga games, which includes pre-configured settings for those games. This means that for the games that are in the database, you won't have to individually configure them, barring a few unusual one-off cases. This is actually a huge advantage of FS, because with WinUAE, you basically had to set up each game individually. You'll still have to do that in some cases with FS, but the OHDLoad does a great job of removing this requirement for a significant number of games. So click on the button to create an account and follow the on-screen prompts for creating it, and then log in. Once you log in for the first time, it should update the game database automatically. But if it doesn't for whatever reason, click the Update Game Database button and let it complete. Now we're going to import some games into our FS library. You can place your files wherever you want, so long as you tell FS where to look for them. If you're using a custom folder for your ROMs like I am, you'll need to add it to the directory list. You can do this through the FS settings in the file database section if you want, or you can just do it through the file database menu by clicking the plus symbol and then choosing the folder where you have your game files located. Now, I'm going to focus primarily on WHDLoad games, which are basically hard drive installed versions of games that reduce load times, remove the need for disk swapping, and don't have crack throws. But all this information is usable for ADF files as well, which I'll go over briefly later on. So now I'm going to direct FS to the folder that contains my WHDLoad zips. These aren't technically ROMs because they're not strictly read-only, but in common verbiage, these are basically our ROMs. Now press the scan button. It'll take a few moments to scan the directories you've specified, but once it's complete, any files it recognizes will now appear in your games list in the main screen. Go ahead and select one of these and press the Start button to test one out if you want. Keep in mind that games will only appear if 1, they have existing entries in the Open Amiga Games database, and 2, your file names match one of the versions it's looking for. There's a guy that goes by the name of Killer Gorilla that's packaged and released a huge number of WHDLoad format conversions, and they've all worked great in my experience. The TOSEC set is a good source for ADF format. So this probably raises an obvious question. What do I do if a game doesn't have its own built-in config because it's not in the UUID? Well, for those, you'll need to create your own config. Now, this might also raise a different question if you already have some prior experience with the FS-UAE and WHDLoad specifically. Why do I need configs at all? Can't I just throw a WHDLoad zip at it and it'll work? Well, technically, yes. Simply directing FS to a WHDLoad zip will typically work in so much as the game will usually load and play. But you don't want to do that, because if you do, it won't use any WHDLoad launch arguments, which you really need in basically all cases for them to run ideally. The most important example of this is the preload switch, which you'll need in order to keep the game from going into full-blown, seizure-inducing flicker mode whenever it's loading data. The preload switch basically caches the entire game before launching so that this doesn't happen. And that switch doesn't get used unless you specifically tell FS to use it via the WHDLoad arguments field, which is set on a per game config basis. If you don't believe that this is as significant as I'm making it out to be, I'll show you a couple examples of the difference so that you can see for yourself. Here's what Defender of the Crown looks like with a proper config, just using the built-in one in this case. Okay, looks pretty good there, no problems. Now let's take a look at it if we just throw the WHDLoad zip at FS with no configuration. For the purposes of this video, the way I'm going to illustrate that is by simply taking out the preload switch here, which is basically what would happen if you just had Launchbox or another front end and you just had your WHDLoad zip and you directed it at FS-UAE. This is what would happen basically. No switches would be used, so it would just use the game name .slave, and that's it. It wouldn't have any special parameters. So this is what it would look like if you were to do that. So I'm going to remove that right here. And let's see what it looks like. Now let's take a look at the game Darkmere with a proper config, again just using the built-in one. All right, looks pretty good, no problem. Now let's throw it zip at FS with no configuration. Oh my god, seizures! If you take a look at any built-in config for a WHDLoad game, you'll notice that they all use this switch. I mean, they really all use it. Some other switches are sometimes necessary, like button wait, which will keep the game from blasting through some screens and will wait for you to press a button before it proceeds. The reason this is necessary is because WHDLoad games load much faster than ADFs, and without that switch, certain screens that contain important information would be skipped over because you were supposed to read them while the game was loading, but that's taking place much faster than the developers intended. Preload is the most important one, though, and you'll want it enabled on every WHDLoad game you play, which means that if the game doesn't have a built-in config, you'll need to create a config for the game and add that switch. To make things a little easier, I'm going to create two default configs that I can use as a starting point for creating custom configs for games. One is for WHDLoad games, and one is for ADFs. With these, all I have to do is select the game file or files, add in any WHDLoad arguments I need, and then save them. It's very quick and easy. For both defaults, I'm going to use the A1200. There will be instances where this may need to change, but by and large, the A1200 works great for most things. Let's make the WHDLoad default first. I just call this one default, but you could name it default parenthesis WHDLoad or whatever you wanted, really, just so long as you know what type it pertains to. So for this one, click the New Config button, and then go to the ROM and RAM tab, click the Fast RAM checkbox, and select 8 meg. All right, now go ahead and add a name to the config name field, then press the Save Config button. Now let's make one for ADF games. This will again be using the A1200, except we'll be using 1 meg of fast RAM instead of 8. Now name it default parenthesis ADF or whatever you want and save it. All right, now whenever we want to set up a config for either a WHDLoad or ADF game, we can use one of these as a starting point. So let's take a look at a game that doesn't have a built-in config, Cyber Assault. This game is technically in the OHDLoad, but it's not published, which means there's no game data or built-in config for it currently. I'm going to be using a WHDLoad version of this, so I'm going to select the default config that I made for those, then go to the hard drive tab, select the add button, and direct it to the Cyber Assault zip. Once you do this, you'll notice the WHDLoad arguments field will now automatically populate with the name of the game.slave. All WHDLoad games will do this. Now, for the reasons I explained earlier, I need to add in the preload switch, so all I have to do here is click in the WHDLoad arguments field, and after cyberassault.slave, I just press space, and then type in all caps preload. Now, all I have to do is name and save this config, just like I did with the defaults. So just type a name in the config name field and press the save button. And there you go. That game is good to go now. Let's go ahead and boot it up to make sure. So you may have noticed something on these games when I've loaded them up briefly. They all have this little introductory screen that will say, press blah 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 button to quit. Now you might be thinking, well, that doesn't really matter since I can just pull up the menu and exit the emulator. So I don't need to pay attention to that. Well, actually you do. The reason is that if you're using WHDLoad games, which is predominantly what I'm using, your save games are only saved temporarily to memory until the actual QuitKey is used. I will repeat that. Until and unless the QuitKey is used, your save games are only saved temporarily to memory. And more to the point, will be lost in the event that the emulation is ended by simply closing it out through the menu. For any games where you want to retain your saves, you must use the actual QuitKey to do so. Think of it as shutting down your computer versus pulling the power. So this presents a problem because unfortunately not all games use the same QuitKey. F10 is the most common, but there's at least half a dozen different keys that you'll see from one game to another. So now you're thinking, well, that sucks. So I have to pay attention to the opening screen and or memorize or note what the key is for every game? Lame. Oh, you're right. It is lame. But don't worry. It pissed me off enough that it drove me to find a solution. You can actually use a file, which I've included a link to in the description, which just needs to be named WHDLoad.prefs and placed in the base FS folder, which will override the QuitKey for every single WHDLoad game you run to whatever you specify. So if you open this up in Notepad, you'll notice there are quite a few lines in it, but all but one of them are commented out. There are other functions that you can enable and tweak here, but the only one I'm using it for is to override the QuitKey. So for the line that starts with QuitKey, you'll see it's followed by equals $59. Where am I getting 59 from? Well, I'm getting it from the high key map hex values table found here. I'll include a link in the description to this as well. Notice the value here under key numbers 50 through 59. Those correspond to function keys F1 through F10. In other words, 50 equals F1, 51 equals F2, etc. So 59 equals F10. Dun, dun, dun. And now it all makes sense. So with this file in the base directory of FS, all WHDLoad games will now use F10 as the QuitKey. I guess it's a good thing we just so happen to have F10 mapped to a button on our controller, huh? Sweet. Now I'll be going over some miscellaneous fixes that you may need to use for some games. The first being the fix for the half color bug. This is something that crops up in a few games, and from what I understand, is a side effect of some Atari ST to Amiga conversions. You'll be able to spot it immediately when you see it. I'll include a link in the description to a list of games known to have this issue, which is incomplete but serves as a good starting point. One game that suffers from it is After the War. Let's take a look at the game without using the fix. See how dark and dull it looks? That's not intentional. And keep in mind, this is how it looks using FS's own config. So without some manual intervention, that's just how it's going to look. The good news is, we can fix it. Frode, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Frode, the developer of FS, actually created a shader called Atari Color Fix specifically to address this issue. From what I understand, it's supposed to come packaged in with FS already, but for whatever reason, it didn't in my case. I found it on GitHub, however, so I was able to recreate the file. I'll include a download link for it in the description as well. So the first thing we need to do is place that file in the base directory of FS. Now, back in the launcher, we're going to create a custom config for After the War, which we can apply this shader to. So once again, let's go to the default config, go to the hard drive tab, click the add button, direct it to the After the War zip, add in preload to the arguments section, name it After the War, and save it. Now we're going to go to the additional configuration tab and click the custom configuration button. All you have to do now is type in shader space equals space Atari-color-fix.shader. Now close this window out and press the save button once again. Now let's load it up and see what we get. You will notice that the OS screen does look weird and unusually bright, but that's okay. We're concerned about what the actual game looks like. Hey, look at that! Much better. So this same process can be used anytime you run into one of the games that exhibit this bug. Just keep in mind that you'll only want to use that shader when it's really needed, because in any other situation, it will make games look awful. One other issue that's worth pointing out is that I've run into a few games that did have built-in configs that either didn't work at all or didn't work very well. And of those, nearly all were ones that were using the A600. I don't know why this would be. Maybe I'm just having bad luck with the particular games I'm playing. I don't know. But I'm really not sure why it would be, given that I'm using the A600 Kickstart file that FS wants. But for whatever reason, the configs that use the A600 seem to have a tendency to be problematic, for me anyway. Not all of them, of course. Some of them work just fine with it. But I will say that there's a predominantly higher number of problems with A600 configs that I've used than there are with A1200 or other configs. So if that ever happens, just like we've gone over already, just create a new config for the game using the default we've created. Citadel is an example of the issue I'm talking about. The built-in config uses the A600, and the game will start, but once it gets past the intro, the game crashes. So let's try making your own config that uses the A1200 instead and see what happens. Another reason you might want to do this is that the QuitKey override doesn't work if the 68,000 CPU is used, which is typically what you'll see for the A600 configs. I don't know if that's a bug or a genuine limitation of that particular CPU. I'm really not sure. The override works correctly with the 68010 though, so even if you use an earlier Amiga model like the A600, you can still take advantage of the override so long as you specify the 68010 or later as the CPU. And I'll show you an example of that later. You can do this in the Additional Configuration tab by checking the CPU box and selecting the CPU from the dropdown. If you use the A1200, you won't have to worry about this because it uses the 68EC020 by default, which works just fine with the override. One special issue I encountered that's worth mentioning is for the game Hostages. There's probably other examples where this might happen that I just haven't run into yet, but this is the one particular kind of weird case that I ran into. This game has sequences where you're supposed to avoid a spotlight to keep from getting shot. But when using the built-in config for the WHDLoad version, which uses the A1200, there seems to be some kind of internal timing problem because the graphics, despite looking fine, don't seem to match what the game is calculating, and you end up getting gunned down every single time, regardless of where the spotlight is on screen. The game is impossible, basically. Let's go ahead and take a look and see what it looks like with the default config. No matter what you do, this is what will happen. It doesn't matter where that spotlight is, you will always get gunned down. WinUAE actually exhibits the same behavior for this game unless you turn on cycle exact in the settings. In the case of FS-UAE, however, it can be fixed by creating a custom config that uses the A500 Plus, maybe the A500. I don't know. I don't remember if I used that one, but the one I'm using is the A500 Plus rather than the A1200. The A500 Plus defaults to the 68,000 CPU, so we'll want to override that to the 68010 in our config as well, so that we can use our QuitKey. One final thing in FS that I'll go over briefly is ADF and CD32 games. As long as you're using ADFs from the TOSEC set, most of them, maybe all of them, will be recognized and imported just like with WHDLoad games. If they're not, or you just want to create your own custom config for the game for any of the reasons we've gone over, or just for the hell of it, the process is similar to creating them for WHDLoad games, except that one, you'll use the default config we made for ADFs as a starting point instead of the WHDLoad one, and two, rather than going to the hard drive tab to add in your game file, we're going to go to the floppy tab to add them in. If it's a single disk game, just click the Browse for File button and direct it to the game disk, and you're good to go. If it's a multi-disk game, you'll want to add the first disk to the first drive, then go to the Media Swap List section, click the plus icon, and add all the disks, including the first one, because sometimes games will ask you to swap back and forth, even back from the second disk to the first disk, etc. This will allow you to swap between them in-game by pulling up the FS menu, going to the disk drive section, and selecting a different disk. Now, you can click the drive count button and specify up to 4 disk drives and just add up to 4 of the disks to those, but be aware that support for reading from multiple disk drives at once varied from game to game, which means in some cases you might have a 3-disk game where you've inserted all 3 and everything works just fine. You don't have to swap anything around while playing. Everything is great. In other instances, however, you might do that and later on be prompted to insert disk 2. You could have it inserted into one of the drives already, but the game might be designed to only look for disks in the first drive. So if that happens, it's not necessarily an indication that anything is wrong with your files or how you have your configuration set up. Some games simply aren't designed to read from multiple disk drives simultaneously. When you load up a game, you can press F12 or Start if you're using a controller, and the FS menu will appear. If you need to change disks, you can do this by moving over to the disk section at the bottom right, selecting the first disk slot, pressing Enter or the fire button on your controller, and as long as you've added all the disks to the media swap list section that I showed earlier, they'll be visible here, and you can select and insert them as needed. I've only tested CD32 games to a limited degree, full disclosure. Even with that limited experience, however, the built-in configs seem to be a bit iffy in my experience. Of course, that could just be because I've done something wrong. I don't know. But one problem I've run into is that some of my files are recognized as Amiga games, but not as actual CD32 games, even though they are. And as a result, the built-in config for them uses a regular Amiga joystick rather than the CD32 pad, which breaks the controls if you're using a controller. That happened for my copy of Gloom, for example. So in those cases, I've had to create my own config and specify that I want it to use the CD32 pad rather than a normal Amiga joystick, and it worked okay afterwards. If you want to create a config for one of these manually, you'll need to go to the CD-ROM tab rather than the hard drive or floppy drive tabs like we've done previously, and add in your CD image. I've got a handful of games set up like this, and they seem to work okay. I'm probably just going to leave it at that, though, simply because I've only messed with them briefly and I don't want to give out bad information. I may revisit this in a later video once I've messed with them some more. Okay, so that does it for FS itself. Now I'm going to go into incorporating it into your Launchbox setup. The first thing we need to do is create two emulator entries for FS and Launchbox. One that we're going to simply call FS-UAE, and the other we're going to call FS-UAE UUID. The reason for this is because we'll be using one of these for games where we're using the built-in config in FS, and one for the games that we've created custom configs for. The way that these have to be set up in Launchbox is such that they're mutually exclusive for one another in their usage. In other words, all the games where we're using the built-in config can only be used with the FS-UAE UUID emulator entry, and all of the games where we'll be using our own configs can only be used with the FS-UAE emulator entry. They won't work if you reverse those. So for the first entry, let's just create one called FS-UAE. This one's simple. All you need to do is name the emulator FS-UAE, direct it to the launcher.exec, go to the Associated Platforms tab, and add in Amiga, or whatever you have the platform named in your library. If you've got it named Commodore Amiga, that's what it needs to be named. Press OK, and that one's done. Next, we'll be creating one called FS-UAE UUID. But we have to do a couple of things first. So now you're probably asking, what the heck is a UUID? Well, it's basically a series of letters and numbers that correspond to a specific version of a specific game, and when that UUID is directed to FS via command line, so long as the corresponding game has been imported into your FS library, it will launch that specific version of that specific game, and most importantly, use the associated built-in configuration for it. So how do you know what the UUID is for any given game, and how do you make use of it? Well, a fellow Launchbox user by the name of Erlon created a wonderful little program that automates this process for you, so that all you have to do is direct it to a file in your FS folder and let her rip. And it'll spit out a bunch of blank files named after the UUIDs for the games in your FS library, which can be imported as ROMs into Launchbox. This sounds more complicated than it really is. It'll make sense when we go through it. Now, in order to get this to work, we'll need to use a special launcher that Erlon created, because there's currently what I'm going to call a bug in FS that causes problems with saves when a game is launched via UUID. The way FS divides up its save games, both save states and normal saves, is by creating folders in the save state folder in FS whenever a game is saved, and it names these folders based on whatever it finds listed in the config name section of the settings INI. The problem is that while this works perfectly fine for launching games from the FS-UI itself, because the config name field actually gets updated in the INI every time you select a game in the UI, it does not update when a game is launched via UUID. This causes a problem because when the name doesn't update, it ends up saving everything into the same folder regardless of what game you're playing, and data ends up getting overwritten or corrupted or lost as a result. With Erlon's launcher, however, we can address this very issue because it updates the settings INI with the correct name when you launch a game with it via UUID. Simply put, you need to use this launcher in order to keep your save games from getting screwed up. Hopefully at some point the issue will be fixed in FS so that this is no longer necessary, but until then, this will work. So the first thing we need to do is download both the launcher and the exporter. I've got links to both of these in the description. These can be placed anywhere. They don't have to be in the same folder as FS-UAE. In the case of the launcher, however, we will need to direct its config to some specific files in the FS folder. We'll only need to do this once. So unzip the launcher wherever you want, and then open up the file named launcher_uuid.exec.config in Notepad. I use Notepad++, and I recommend it highly if you don't use it, but regular old Notepad should work as well. It's just a lot easier to read in Notepad++. Now, once you've opened it, you're going to need to find 3 lines in it. Launcher_SQLite, settings_ini, and launcher_exe. Under these, you'll see a section that says value and then a path. You'll need to update these paths to whatever they are on your computer. For launcher_SQLite, you'll need to direct it to the file located in FS-UAE, data subfolder, databases subfolder, then launcher.SQLite. For settings_ini, you'll need to direct it to the file located in FS-UAE, data subfolder, then settings.ini. For launcher_exec, it just needs to be directed to your FS-UAE launcher exec. Now save and close. Now we're ready to set up the second emulator entry in Launchbox for UUIDs. The setup process is basically the same as the first, except that we're going to name it FS-UAE UUID, and then we're going to need to check the don't use quotes and use file name only without extension or folder path boxes. This is why we need 2 separate entries in Launchbox, because these checks will prevent it from working with anything other than UUIDs, and launching a UUID won't work without them. For this one, we'll also need to direct it to Erlon's launcher instead of the normal fs launcher.exec in order to ensure that our save data is created and separated properly like I explained earlier. So let's go ahead and add it to the application path, and then we'll be good to go. Okay, now we're ready to start exporting the UUIDs from FS. Basically, all we're doing here is creating shortcuts to specific versions of specific games and their corresponding configurations. When we direct a specific UUID to FS through the command line, we're telling it, hey, I want you to use the WHDLoad version of whatever game and use the corresponding built-in config for it. So for the games where we want to do this, games where there is a built-in config and we want to use it, we're going to be using those UUIDs in combination with the FS-UAE UUID emulator entry that we just created. So how do we do that? Well, this is where Erlon's exporter comes in. What it's going to do is look at the games we have imported into our FS library, pull the appropriate UUIDs for those, and dump them as blank files named after the UUIDs, and put them into separate folders named after the game title. We'll then be able to use them as ROMs in Launchbox. Obviously, they're not really ROMs at all. They're just instructions to tell FS what game plus config to start. So now let's pull up Erlon's exporter. The first thing we need to do here is direct it to the launcher.sqlite file. So press the Open Launcher.sqlite button, go to the FS-UAE folder, Data subfolder, Databases subfolder, and double-click on the launcher.sqlite. Now we need to tell it where we want to dump the files. I like to do this to a temp folder, 1, so that I'm not potentially altering any files that I'm directing Launchbox to, and 2, so that I can dump everything from my FS library, but pick and choose specific versions that I'll use to import into my Launchbox library. So I'm going to click on the Choose Target folder button and direct it to the temp folder that I created in the exporter folder. Now we've got 2 options we can enable if we so choose. Export only 1 variant per game, and folder name without variants name. This first option is for instances where you have multiple versions of the game in your FS library. Let's say you have both an ADF version and a WHDLoad version of the game, but you don't want to export UUIDs for both of them. If you select this option, it will choose whatever version comes first in the version drop-down list for the ones you've imported. I've asked Erlon if an option could be added that would actually prompt you to choose a specific version that you want to export if you have multiple, and he said it's possible, but that it'll take some time. So that's something he's working on, but it hasn't been implemented yet. So I'm going to leave this unchecked. Because I'm dumping these to a temp folder first, I can always just pick and choose the ones I want for the purpose of importing in a Launchbox anyway. The second option is folder name without variant name. If you don't have this checked, when you do the export, it will create folders with the game title, and then in brackets, it will have the specific version, like let's say ADF v1.1 or something. If you do have it checked, it will just name the folders after the game title. I actually don't recommend using this option either, simply because the sections in brackets will be ignored when determining the game title when you import them into Launchbox anyway. So the end result is simply that you don't know which version your file corresponds to with this checked. So I'm going to leave both of those unchecked and then press the Start Export button. And there we go, the export is done. So here you can see the specific version in brackets like I mentioned. As I said, these are going to be ignored when we do our import into Launchbox anyway, so it's not going to hurt anything. Now, what I would do is pick the ones I wanted to import into Launchbox, or if I wanted to just dump them all in there, I could, and then copy them into another folder that I actually want to use permanently with Launchbox. So I'm going to create another folder here that I'm just going to call UUIDs, where I'll be copying them. So now, if I want to import these into Launchbox, all I have to do is select them and drag them into the Launchbox UI. I'll need to indicate that they're Amiga games and that I want to use the FS-UAE UUID as the emulator. Now, when I get to the custom options page of the import wizard, I'm going to check the Use Folder Names instead of ROM file names for game titles button. The reason being that if I don't, it's going to list the game title as the UUID, as you can see here, and obviously that isn't very helpful. Once we check the Use Folder Names option, however, hey, look at that. They've all got the correct game titles, and as I said, they ignore the portion of the folder name that's contained in brackets, which is exactly what we want. I've already done this in my library, so I'm just going to cancel, but normally you would just select Next, it would scrape the titles for metadata, and you'd be good to go. Now, as you can see here, if I edit one of these entries in my library, the ROM path is going to be directed to the UUID file, and the emulator used is FS-UAE UUID. So now if I start this game in my library, voila, it launches straight into the correct game in config. But what about the ones where we've created our own configs? What do we do with those? Well, it's really simple. All we have to do is go to our FS folder, where we'll find a folder named Configurations. In that folder, you'll find all the config files that you've created in FS-UAE. All we have to do with these is select them and drag them into the Launchbox UI, just like we did with the UUIDs. Now we're going to again indicate that they're Amiga games, only this time we're going to choose the normal FS-UAE emulator entry, not the UUID one. And when we get to the custom options screen of the import wizard, we're not going to select the Use Folder Names option. And there you go. Now when we launch one of these, it will launch the correct game and use the configuration that you've created. So that's it. No biggie, right? I mean, it only took an hour to get through all that. In all seriousness, though, I hope you found this video useful and informative. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them here or on the Launchbox forums. I'd like to do some more tutorials in the future. C64, Atari 8-bit computers, Atari ST, and DOSBox are all prime candidates. And maybe just more stuff on emulation in general. I think it's a really interesting hobby and subculture that's worth talking about. Before I can get into any of that, though, I think I'm going to need a nap. So until next time, peace out and have fun.